So good evening and welcome to the Year 21 journey, live from the EastSide Visitor Centre on Belfast's Newtownards Road. Thanks go to Claire and Chris for assembling a stellar panel. My name is Jason Burke, historian and host of the Historical Belfast podcast, which for the purposes of tonight can be referred to as the second best local history podcast on the airwaves, I think. Alongside me are your critically acclaimed Year 21 podcast hosts, Declan Harvey and Tara Mills. On the other side of me is historian and broadcaster Dr. Eamon Phoenix, who was described to me recently as Northern Ireland's historian laureate.
That's fantastic.
I like that.
So Year 21 reconstructs the events of 1921 week by week using ordinary people's stories, archival research and insights from expert historians. It explores the year of Northern Ireland's formation in surprising and original ways. Tonight I'll be attempting to guide the conversation between our panellists by posing a series of questions, but we'll also be looking for some contributions from the floor from our invited guests towards the end. Now, having never chaired an event such as this before, I'm usually one of the panellists. I decided to seek some advice from a former colleague of yours, none other than Seamus McKee. And when Seamus asked me who was on the panel, and I said Tara Mills and Declan Harvey, he said, give them hell. That was a joke, he didn't really. But what I do notice about Seamus is that he likes to start with something hard-hitting and controversial, presumably to get the interviewee on the back foot. So Declan, Eddie Spence's Chippy in East Belfast, what's the verdict?
Do you mean of the food?
Of the food. Now, bearing in mind you're in East Belfast.
The truth is that the pasty, which is mentioned in the episode, didn't in fact make its way back to Broadcasting House. Okay. Tara is the only one who knows where that pasty went. We're reliably informed it was purchased, but it never made it back to the studio. So what I'm eating in the episode is in fact my lunch.
Okay, Tara, the same question to you.
What's the verdict?
The truth, do you know what? I didn't even buy a pasty in the end. I have to be honest. I went to the fish and chip shop in Spence's on the way home, and they were closed. It was 7:15. It said they were closing at 7:30, but I kind of knocked on the door, and I had to go in and then talk to Bill Spence for about half an hour to convince him to come on the podcast because he was having none of it. Didn't want to do it, said it's not my thing, but he was so engaging and obviously had such a great family story to tell. So I said, well look, if you won't come on, I'll at least, it was actually fish and chips I bought and brought them home to the family. And then just as I was leaving with the fish and chips under my arm, he said, actually come back at this time tomorrow night and I'll talk to you. And he did.
So Eamon, for Eddie Spence's Chippy on the Beersbridge Road to reach its centenary year this year is quite a remarkable achievement, but I'm wondering, are there any other historic chippies we should be mindful of in the city?
Yeah, I think we have to think of Longs at the interface between Sandy Row and the Pound. Famous 19th century riot spot, it was right in the middle. I don't know if they repaired there on both sides for fish suppers every now and again, but certainly Longs goes back to 1936. I think it's still, certainly not very recently, in the hands of the same family. I also remember in the 1960s Smoky Joe's in University Road, which was an Italian joint, Allegedly Smoky just knew two words, fish and cheap, the only two words. But students used to queue up, and many love affairs, blossomed in Smoky Joe's. Okay.
I'm going to stick with you for the meantime, Eamon, because there are people out there, believe it or not, who say that the events of the past should be left in the past. And that the events of 100 years ago have no bearing on our situation today. But can you help us and the viewers and the guests here understand just how pivotal the year 1921 was in the context of Irish history and how important it is for us today?
Oh no, it's a central year. I mean, understanding what happened 100 years ago, and you mentioned 1920, 21, 22, that period, but the big focus is in 21, which saw effectively, if you look at the whole year, the birth of two Irish states. I mean, Northern Ireland, which was opened in state by the King in June 1921, and then of course the Irish Free State, which for a period included legally Northern Ireland, was inaugurated in December 1921. So by 1922, you effectively had two Irish states, but you had the whole backcloth of violence, polarisation, population movements, population displacement, a legacy that we would live with, particularly north of the border, you know, for the next kind of 100 years in one way or another, trying to deal with it in more recent decades. So, I mean, it's absolutely critical. And I mean, I go back to the words of the famous Irish historian F.S.L. Lyons, who was a Protestant born in Derry, Londonderry, became Provost of Trinity College, Dublin. In Ireland, he said, to understand the past is to cease to live in it. And that would be a mantra of mine in getting people to critically examine the past and consider other viewpoints apart from their own, and try to empathise with people from different communities. If you look back to that time, East Belfast was a war zone on all sides. Shocking things happened here on both sides of the road, you know, and trying to, you know, return to that and look at that. Could that have been avoided? And how do we build a better society?
And for you, in the year in the round in 1921, is there one moment that sticks out? Is there a defining moment for you, a turning point, something which stands out above all else?
Well, I suppose the turning point is the King's speech in Belfast City Hall. I mean, for the whole island. I mean, the King was setting his seal on the opening of a partitionist parliament for 6 counties, which was the demand of James Craig and the Unionists. But he was very careful to use his words for a grand gesture, for a grandiloquent gesture of peace. I mean, the King was concerned about the rising violence in Ireland. He was concerned about the reprisal policy, which was spiralling. A lot of innocent people died in 1920, 1921. And he spoke to the South African Prime Minister, Jan Smuts. He wanted to make a difference, not just read something an official had written. And he came to Belfast City Hall at a time of great violence. His wife was very affrighted, Queen Mary, by coming to Belfast at that juncture. And of course he called on Irishmen to forgive and forget, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, and seek for the land that they love a new era of peace, contentment and goodwill. Now that of course transformed the situation between Britain and Southern Ireland. You know, you had the truce, you had the beginnings of the treaty negotiations, you would have an agreement in the end. Had less effect in Belfast where violence rumbled on, but nonetheless it was a major intervention. And when Prince Charles visited Belfast City Hall back in May to meet the historians for half an hour, he was dwelling on great granddaddy's speech in that chamber a century ago.
Yeah, and I was there during that meeting. He was
You were
extremely,
there.
he was
You were
extremely
there.
tuned
He
in.
was, absolutely.
And I still tell the story now, actually. You were chatting away to me whenever Prince Charles came into the room, and all the photographs that were taken of that occasion, I'm the only one sitting around the table without a suit jacket on, breaking the etiquette, you know, facing the future king without, and I blame you for it, still blame you for it, you know. Declan, I want to turn to you now. I want to take you back to the beginning of the process, because the centenary of partition and the creation of Northern Ireland, it has the potential to be a tricky matter to engage with. Many organisations chose to avoid it. So I'm wondering what sort of conversations were happening within BBC Northern Ireland about this, and why was it felt that there was a need to engage with this in the first place?
Whatever conversations have been had in BBC Northern Ireland, I don't think, well, I know I wasn't privy to them, I don't think you were particularly privy to them either, but knowing the BBC as I do, I suspect they were very in-depth kind of analytical conversations about how we were going to do this, the risks to the BBC, but the risks to the audiences and causing offence, and acknowledging all the trips and potential hazards in the year to come. That's not how Year 21 started. Year 21 started standing at Tara's desk. Actually, probably
Around
a year,
time, yeah.
a year to the day, or close to that. And we were approaching the signing of the Government of Ireland Act, which is December 20th. Yeah, and we were approaching that date, and we were saying, oh yeah, what are we doing? And is there anything really happening? We haven't really heard that anything's happening. And that then became probably an admission to each other that I'm not really even sure, you know, really how much I know about 1921, and I want, you know, we should probably know more, and we don't. And how come we don't know more? And why weren't we taught this clear? And why isn't this more present if it was so important as they were saying that it would be? Maybe we should do a podcast. Yeah, maybe we should do a podcast. We need permission to do a podcast. Well, let's ask if we can do a podcast. And then I think within the space of 4 or 5 days, it had been signed off on the back of a napkin, really. And they told us, they said, look, there's no need to do 50 episodes week by week. Do one a month, or do even 21 episodes. It'll be fine. No, it's got to be weekly. We'll do 50. Well, we did 50 because we thought that's slightly shorter than than 52. So we cut that slight corner. We thought we'll do 50 episodes, and it's all about the week by week telling of it. It'll be great. You'll love it. And they said, all right, go for it. That seems a long time ago now because 50 episodes was much more of an undertaking than we thought. But in terms of strategizing how it would be, we considered, it started off actually, you're why it started.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Actually, Tara and I had
yes.
a chance meeting. We were covering the end of the First World War, 2018, and we had a chat about, doing something about the centenary. And Tara was I said, the BBC could do something coming up to 1920, 2020, 2021, marking the centenary. And Tara was animated by it as well. Also, there was a sort of a panel of historians consulted with the BBC. I was one of them, about October 2020, to consider this. The historians from North and South were considering the whole thing. And we had all the programme makers there, who were likely to be doing something. And I must say, we didn't discuss podcasts at all. We talked about marking certain events, certain key events, such as the violence, the truce, the treaty, what was happening on the border that was being drawn up. We did all that kind of thing. But it raised an awareness, really, that this was too important to overlook, In a divided society moving on. We would have to acknowledge it. And we've done very well so far in terms of marking the centenary from 1912 to 1914, the Rising, the Somme, the private armies. We've done all that, but we somehow had to try to get this right, even though it was more challenging in many ways.
Yeah, because I think in 2016, whenever we went to Kilmainham Jail, Eamon was taking a group of people just from here, on both sides of the interface, and we had a conversation, and I'd gone over to the Somme to do the centenary programme, and I remember, I say this right at the very beginning, that I didn't even do history GCSE. I stopped in third year and went kind of science orientated. And it's always been a big regret because it's something that it's very difficult to kind of catch up on, a big kind of wealth of knowledge of that. And it's always felt like a gap. And whenever I was doing the Somme research, every page I was turning in every book, I was thinking, oh, right, okay, that feels like that's the route to what has happened in Northern Ireland rather than 1969 or 68 or 67. And obviously working in the media as well, it felt to me that everything we have done over the past 50 years started at the late 60s and almost like in a prism shape, and then it kind of expanded out to today. But I wanted to see then, well, what's behind all of that? So we had that conversation. And actually, it's interesting, Declan says it was done on the back of a napkin. And I think that was the key to it getting commissioned, because if we had had those big, and that's what happens, and the BBC takes these things very seriously, and rightly so. But I think if we had overthought it and, put too much of that kind of corporate pressure on ourselves, it might never have been made. Because I did make sort of attempts to get a history series made, but there was kind of, oh no, And I think there was a thing about 2016 which I think was slightly easier in that you could kind of go and do the Somme commemoration, you could do the Easter Rising commemoration, and it felt, well, we can all look at the other side, if you like, and yeah, okay, well, yes, I can see that was a pivotal moment for that community, and I can see that was a pivotal.
Here? It was in another place.
And it was in another place. So I think it meant that we could remember separately, but, have a bit of generosity of spirit, if you like. But I think there's something about 1921 that is fundamentally different than 1916, and I think that's where it became. But I have to say, we'll probably touch on this, as the year progressed, I definitely felt that the kind of anxiety, if you like, at the beginning of the year, when everybody was quite tense about it and felt quite, I had really felt by sort of June, July, August, that had started to kind of fade away. Now, obviously, there was a bit of a hiccup about a month ago where things got a bit fraught again. But I think we've definitely, it's actually been much easier than we probably thought to talk about all of the issues that we've talked about, because people have brought their own personal story and their own history.
I think somebody mentioned already, I think it was you, Eamon, you said about empathy. And I think that has been our guiding principle instinctively, actually. never explicitly kind of agreed. It was just about empathy. And the first thing we wrote was the rules of engagement, which is the first little mini bit at the start. And that was the first thing. We just got our thoughts around paper. Go, how do we want people to approach this? And although we don't say it explicitly in the rules of engagement, that's essentially what it's asking people to bring to the process. Just, if something is said, rather than losing the head, just wait for next week or next month or whatever, and we'll get to it. So if we use the word pogroms, just don't shout at us, because we'll balance it up and we'll qualify it and just take it as a year. But front and centre throughout that whole process is not the shouting. It's been people and people's stories, and fathers and mothers and sons and daughters, and the terrible things that happened 100 years ago. And that, I think, has been really important. It's the human tales of it.
And funny, because on the way up, I was listening to the Rules of Engagement in episode 1 again, just, because I was sort of driving up, and we actually said that in those early episodes, get in touch, and we give the email out, but I don't think we had any expectation that so many people would get in touch and that their stories would be so utterly gripping. I mean, there've been a couple of stories across the year that will never leave me. I would say most people feel the same if they've listened to it, So people obviously felt, and I mean, we've Eamon to thank for this as well, the kind of the genius storyteller, but also you have people in this network around the world. So very often when they've got in touch with us, they've said, well, I started the family research and I got in touch with a Belfast historian called Eamon Phoenix. Like, yes, we know him well.
That great story of the chemist who lost his business in Donegal Street. I mean, there's so many human stories. And we brought out, I think, the complexity of the period. There's no sort of my country right or wrong. The sufferings of vast numbers of people, was it a siege or a pogrom? People will never agree on that, but certainly all communities were impacted. There were some shocking stories, some Gothic acts of barbarism, on both sides. In Belfast, on the border, in those years. People kept them in their hearts. And when it came to the 60s, when things were becoming problematic again after 1966 and then civil rights in 68, I mean, I know old people were whispering about, the Weaver Street bombings or the shipyard tram bombings or the Mcburney murders, at that stage. And, older people, and you would ask them and you would get a snatch of something awful that they'd buried in their subconscious from 1921 or 1922. Now, I think we have helped to sort of, in some ways, we've put some of those spirits to rest, because in that period, very few people found justice. Shocking things happened. You think of the bombing of the children playing on the lamppost in Weaver Street in North Belfast, a sectarian bomb attack. Or you think of the Protestant family at Altnevay, the 6 families who were targeted in 1922 by the IRA. And I mean, that was the end of it. People died, they were buried, their families remembered. I know that's happened in the last 50 years as well, and we're finding it very difficult to deal with. But at least we are trying to deal with that period now, when it can be informed by police reports, by cabinet papers, by Collins meeting Craig and Churchill. There's a lot going on, and we've tried to give a flavour of that. But as you say, Declan and Tara, the response of ordinary people in, saying, well, look, I'll tell you my story. They were emboldened to tell their story because of what we had sort of wheeled out in the previous months.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of people had said as well that, the chemist is the perfect example of that. He wanted, he's living in Australia. He has no, direct experience of living here or anything about it. He's living a great life with a big kind of expat family. But he knows that he's only in that fortunate position because of the trauma that his grandfather suffered. And the overriding message that he wanted to sort of tell was, I want to bring my grandfather home. He had to be sedated to get on the boat to go to Australia. He didn't want to go. He loved Belfast, and he didn't live long. I think he lived about 12 years after he got to Australia.
Alcoholic, yeah.
He was an alcoholic and, fell on hard times over there as well. but that sense of, and it was a really emotional thing for Ian, and he's been in touch a couple of times since, and he's listened on. But I think the permanence of the record is also something that we didn't consider at all at the beginning. We weren't setting out to go, we'll have this and it'll be a record forever. It didn't even enter our heads. We were just going week by week, tell the story. And then at some point, probably in the middle and in the summertime, when people started to say, oh, well, that means that story will always be there. Then that actually means something to those families, and they want that little bit of their history to have a kind of platform, and we kind of have given them a voice, I suppose.
I think you mentioned in one of the very early episodes, Tara, about the Irish history that you were taught in school was limited, maybe, to be generous about it. Yeah. Did that ever daunt you whenever you took on this podcast?
Oh, hugely. And funny, looking back at the Somme, by the time we had finished the Somme programme, I felt as if I'd sat an A-level in the Somme, because I literally knew nothing apart from the date and that a lot of people had died. I mean, I kid you not, I really had a very limited knowledge of it. So I kind of immersed myself in it, and I mean, I think that we've both been lucky in that regard, that this has been our journey of discovery. So we haven't, it wasn't about us going and studying all the kind of historical books, or all the history books. It was about going on the journey with the listener, and that was the kind of key to the project. Eamon was our expert, our first expert, always on hand, and then we've brought in other people, historians from all over the place to help us. But yeah, there was definitely, and I certainly feel much more educated about the year now than I did this time last year, that's for sure.
I think what's interesting is that on our radio programme, very often you'll have a sense of where you want the interview to go, and you'll say, well, I know if I ask that question, it will elicit an interesting area of conversation, because you get a bit of a briefing. Whereas this year has almost exclusively been just our nose taking us somewhere, asking an honest question because you don't know the answer, but being constantly delighted, I suppose is the word, by the response. I just had no idea. So it's been a fairly wide-ranging conversation we've had all year. It hasn't been, that's why we say it's not like the history book. We haven't ever tried to plot out the journey. We've been quite happy for it to go in different areas and just go off on tangents quite happily, because that's where our interest is taking us.
Definitely. And although we've done, if you look at the list, we knew that we needed to do some of the big figures. We needed to do the Carson and the Craig and the Collins and the De Valera, and those episodes were important, and they're the ones that have ended up sort of on the curriculum, on the website to help students, and that's fantastic, and we're really proud of that. But then somebody like Ian Mcburney, or Mary Kiley was another woman who got in touch with us, who had left Belfast when she was 18 and sat and recounted her story. It was after the King's visit. Her grandfather was a ceremonial guard, and he's pictured in the paper, the 6'6" in his stockinged feet. I always remember that phrase that she said. And she had emailed in and said, this is my link to 1921, perhaps you'd be interested. And her grandfather was a Protestant who married a Catholic from Armagh, so there was a kind of little bit of the nuance and the complexity of mixed marriage in those days. And then just all of a sudden she says, we always wondered why my granny was so grumpy, and now we know she'd lived in Clonard and in the midst of all this sectarian violence, and obviously had been, quite traumatised by what had happened to her. And Mary said, it was only when I looked through the history, and she died in 1972, and then she said, and then my brother was killed in 1975, and in a way I was glad that my granny didn't have to go through that trauma as well. And talk about being stopped in your tracks. I was like, what? And, so this is a family that, talk about intergenerational trauma. So you have the 1921 story, of the troubles of then, and then another trauma for the family in 1975. And it was a really heart-stopping kind of moment.
I think it's really interesting that people have been so willing to take part. And I think it comes from a place that they want their relatives' story to be included. If we're going to tell the story of 1921 and we're going to offer a gap for people to step into, it's been amazing how people said, yeah, actually, I'll tell you my story. These are not people who would normally be interviewed with a microphone in front of them, but they want to kind of step forward and say, well, look, if you're telling the story, I'd quite like you to, include this about my, great uncle or great aunt or whatever. And that's been really interesting. I don't know what that says about our...
Well, Winston's the perfect example of that. I'm not going to tell you about his story because it hasn't been broadcast yet, and there will be no spoilers tonight. But, you know, this is a man who's 90, 91, and he got in touch, and we just went and interviewed him in Bangor on Friday, and that was absolutely his motivation.
Yeah.
I mean, he said, you know, I realised that, you know, I'm at this sort of latter part of my life and I wanted my story to be told. And it was a kind of another standout moment of the year on Friday, and standing outside his door in Bangor.
I was just going to ask you, Declan, do you think that the approach to the podcast has evolved over the year? If someone was to listen to an episode, the most recent episode, compared to some of the first ones, do you think they would notice much of a difference?
I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know. Going back to your first question, how much of it was designed and planned? I mean, really, this has been so organic. And if you listen to episode 1, which I think is called The Table, where we go looking for that table that isn't in fact.
Yes, I do.
It's whether the table is the table that was signed on or not, and it's probably not. But it made a good opening. So we went and recorded that, and we didn't really know what it would sound like, and we didn't know whether we would be including jokes, for want of a better expression, or whether we would be including us kind of just in conversation or chatting or laughing, and whether it would lend itself to a bit of humour or whether it wouldn't. And actually, as it turns out, the humour has been so important to get us all through the horror of it all, and people have consistently commented that we can talk about this with a lightness of touch. So none of that was by design, and we didn't know that we would start to not even reconstruct certain sequences, but give a hint of a bit of reenactment, the sound of a street or the sound of a tram or a gunshot, and none of that was in the original plan, but it was in the first episode, because as you're sitting down to edit it, you're thinking, it's getting a bit boring now, we need to put in something to kind of elevate this a little bit, and then you start going down a warren of, is it an indoor gunshot or an outdoor gunshot? Is it a big gun or a small gun? Is it a big car or a lorry? And you start to really consider all those sounds.
Is it an owl or a bird?
An owl or a bird. Or is it, So a lot of that stuff has become more complex over the year. Absolutely, we've become bolder. At the start, we don't really do any sound effects of people talking. It's a lot of... And now actually, as time's gone on, we've gotten a bit braver with reconstructing the voices. And somebody asked me recently, like, where do you get these sound effects? These people talking and saying exactly the right things. It's my 5-year-old niece, it's my mother, it's your sister, it's my brother standing outside. I just want you to imagine you're standing outside Downing Street, okay, and you're shouting up the Rebels. Now you have to record it outside. So, and famously, not famously at all, famously in my mind, a few weeks ago, again outside Downing Street, they were saying the Rosary. The crowds had gathered as Michael Collins and we're heading into the Rosary. So I rang my parents, and my sister was around in their house and said, I need you to go out to the back garden. And I need you to record the Rosary. And they said, well, okay, that's a bit weird. Just a few decades will do, you'd call it. But when they went out to the back garden, then suddenly they realised next door had roofers on their shed. So they rang back and said, do we have to do it outside? It has to be outside, because acoustically it's got to be outside. So they ended up having to walk about half a mile down to a forest, down the road, because they felt a bit conscious of being seen in the back garden saying the Rosary. Maybe that's just more about how Ireland has changed over the years as well, I don't know. Back in 1921 that wouldn't have been so strange.
But we also went into the field in early days. We were wearing masks last January, February, and we went to, for example, the site of the old Railway View Hotel in Oxford Street, where 2 policemen were shot dead, a 3rd wounded, going to give evidence at a trial relating to the War of Independence in the South, but was being held in Belfast because it was considered a safer location. Now, the bar was there until the 1980s. It was at the corner of Town Hall Street, quite close to police headquarters, which is why these policemen were staying there on a winter's night in 1921. And of course, the whole thing was informed now by the police reports, by witness statements, by IRA men involved that are now in the Bureau of Military History Archives. So we would really try to bring the whole thing to life, because we had lots of information about that particular event, Yeah. And then we went downtown another day where Black and Tans were shot dead. You remember Victoria Square? Yeah. And the same outlines are there, the same buildings, and we kind of recalled that. So it was strange for us going down. This was at a time of semi-lockdown. There were very few people around a lot of the times we were out recording this, and the show was going on. And then, of course, lots of people were at home listening to radio, engaged in all this. And that probably augmented the public response to what we were doing, and people told their relatives overseas, and the chemist story and other came in, because you think you know a lot about this, and I kind of do, but I know an awful lot more now because of what this has generated. And I'm imagining that in terms of oral history, unlikely oral history 100 years on, a lot of it has been conserved by this exercise,
I might just stick with you, Eamon, if I may. To make a great history podcast, you need great historians. And you've been an ever-present in this decade of centenaries from 2010. It's the longest decade I've ever known anyway. I've seen you speaking at the Ulster Museum back in 2010 or 2011, whatever it was, with the Community Relations Council. So you've been an ever-present. But I'm wondering, from the historian's point of view, why is it important for historians to come out of their ivory towers and come out of the archives to engage with things like this?
No, I always did public history. I was always interested in local history as well as the big story, So I was always interested in, the local mills, the people who worked in them, the impact of the war on communities and the Falls and the Shankill. That was all part of it. Unfortunately, a lot of very privileged people I have met and I've taught in night classes, and various people, doctors and lawyers, have all said to me, we never did Irish history at school, as you've been implying there, It was the kings and queens of England, And when a new history of Ireland was being proposed about 1963, both governments on the island were approached by very eminent historians like, Theo Moody and, J.C. Beckett. Will you fund this? A brand new history by, the latest, objective historians. And the Stormont Cabinet discussed it under Terence O'Neill and decided, well, no. Some of them had a sense of history, had studied history, but Irish history is too incendiary. And anyway, it might be used for propaganda purposes. Better stay away from it. So there was always that sense that, I think historically, more Irish history was probably taught in Catholic schools than in Protestant or state schools. That was kind of the way. Different kind of history was taught. It wasn't until 1988. It wasn't until 1988 that we actually had a national curriculum here, which was agreed, when at key stages 2, 3 and 4 you had the same history being taught across the board, from the Vikings and the Normans, to Carson and Redmond, to partition and the Irish Civil War. That was the first time we had that core, really up to about age 15, 16. And that took a very long time, 1988, and partition occurred in 1921, so we have a sense of that. So, there was Irish history, yet people out there were interested. It's always considered, if you're going to go to a mixed community, talk about the mills, or talk about the ODR strike of 1932, when Orange and Green briefly united in East Belfast and West Belfast, Don't talk about the war or any other wars, But we've moved away from that now. And thanks to programs like this and educational developments, it's possible now. I've spoken to audiences everywhere, from South Armagh to the Shankill Road, from East Belfast to South Fermanagh, talking about the events of that decade, Carson's Army, Home Rule, the Easter Rising, the Great War in both communities, partition. That whole story has been turned out there. And again, people will come along with their memorabilia that is laying in the attic, for a very, very long time. And they'll tell stories in public that people will be amazed at. I always tell the famous one that when Churchill came to Belfast in 1912 to speak in favour of Home Rule as a Liberal minister. He arrived up at Celtic Park where the meeting was held because the Ulster Hall was taken over by, unhappy shipyard workers. And he congratulated the people of the Falls Road, 8th February 1912, for the vast profusion of Union Jacks that were flying to greet him as he came to join John Redmond and Lord Perry on the platform to support Home Rule. People are amazed, Union Jacks on the Falls Road, So it's amazing the stories that you can now tell publicly and which people will acknowledge and maybe add to,
Do you think in Northern Ireland, Eamon, sometimes we're guilty of telling ourselves a version of the past as we would like it to have been, rather than how it actually is, for the greater good, for the benefit of community relations?
Yes, people would say, things were getting great, and then all this started talking about the 60s or whatever. I think this is the problem, that we tend to always be nostalgic about the past anyway. Our childhoods were the sunny days and the sunny holidays, and it never rained, and now the weather has changed for the worst, since I became 40 or whatever it is, I think that's absolutely true. But I think I always felt that a check on that was talking to people who lived through those days. I mean, I did as a child talk to a number of people. I remember an old lady who had been badly wounded in a bomb explosion at St Matthew's Church in East Belfast. Got £100, Madge told me. A bomb was thrown into the porch, and she had those wounds from that period. So I knew that awful things had clearly happened. You were just getting, you know, a sort of a snatch of it, you know, or you could see through the kind of, you know, the dark curtain for a second. There was a chink of light, you could see something. And then you discovered that this was more general. You know, you became aware of, you know, buildings, places associated with dark deeds from that period. People would talk about things. The McMahon murders was a big one. The bombing of shipyard trams, depending on which community you're in, that was another one during that period. So I think this idea of, you know, being nostalgic about the past, the amazing thing is that shocking violence in Belfast, which saw, let's be honest, nearly 500 people killed, some shockingly wounded, including small children. Most of the people, innocent civilians, going about their work, they had to run the gauntlet of snipers, you know, and assassins during that period. 8 to 9,000 people driven out of their work because of their religion. People in border Protestant communities driven out of their homes and farms coming north. You had that whole dislocation. And I mean, it left a very hard border on this island in the mid-1920s. And if you think about that, I mean, Michael Collins met James Craig twice in 1922. They signed 2 agreements. Craig met De Valera once in 1921 for 4 hours. But there were no more meetings after 1925 for 40 years. A Cold War enveloped all of that for 40 years. And it wasn't until O'Neill met Lemass in 1965 that Cold War, you know, was finally kind of ended. And yet that was the prelude to the Troubles as we know them today, you know. So nostalgia doesn't really help. You really have to confront, you know, the kind of obscenity of violence and its causes, and acknowledge that, you know, you get to a point in life, you know, when people are young, they want everybody to share their perspective, you know. I'm a loyalist, I'm a unionist, I'm a Republican, I'm a nationalist, everybody should think like me. As you get older, you don't expect people to think like you. You expect them to have different views because they have different backgrounds, different formations, different influences. And I think that's something that this series is exploring, that people are actually empathizing with individuals from different political perspectives, different community backgrounds, different horrific experiences, because they're humanitarian stories.
Yeah, I think you're right. It has explored the sequence of events, warts and all, and that brings me to the next question, Tara. In one of the early episodes, you used the phrase that history is selective, and that we should be starting from the historical facts. But who decides the historical facts? And the question that I'm asking is, who's guiding this podcast? Is there an editorial process? Who decides what the topics are? Is there anything that you won't touch because it's too hot to handle?
No, there hasn't been anything that we haven't touched. I mean, as Declan said earlier, you know, it has been incredibly organic. We knew at the beginning we would have those kind of the big characters of the year, and we would need to explore that. And actually, that was really interesting. You know, even it's funny how some of the people who were remembered, you know, Collins obviously has the film and, you know, the drama around him. Craig, it's only as the year has gone on that I find it sort of surprising that Carson is the unionist hero and not Craig, because actually we call him the granite-faced Ulsterman, but you know, he stuck to his guns. Pardon the pun. I mean, he stuck to his viewpoint and his principle in such a kind of rigid way that it surprises me in some ways that he is not kind of remembered more favourably by unionists who feel very strongly, you know, today about the union. So there've been sort of some surprises that I have reflected on across the year. Arthur Griffith as well. Now that we're into the treaty talks, the prominence of his role, the importance of his role, and yet all the conversation at the start of the year was, you know, about De Valera and Collins, and why was Collins sent and why did De Valera not go? Well, actually, for me, it's more about, you know, what was Arthur Griffith's role in all of this, and how pivotal he was to the eventual signing of the treaty in December. So I don't think there definitely wasn't anything that we couldn't touch. Far from it. In fact, we just faced everything with a kind of openness and allowed different. I mean, yes, there were certainly episodes that we probably had, you know, were careful about making sure that there was a equality of thought and, you know, different perspectives. But I don't think, you know, with BBC training, that's not very difficult to achieve. You know, we were coming at it in a completely, honestly impartial way, and we were on a journey of discovery. So we've remained, you know, objective about it all. We've had discussions about different characters along the way. Probably the Black and Tans and the B specials, there was certainly, that was probably the episode we thought most about and talked most about, and went back over and over and over and over again, I think, a little bit.
And the Lost Counties
Lost Counties as well. You know, even that phrase, Lost Counties, and, you know, we had a colleague in the newsroom from Monaghan who went, what do you mean, Lost Counties? Do you know what I mean? Well, did that need to be in parenthesis then, the Lost Counties? It depends on your perspective whether they were lost or not. So there've definitely been really kind of interesting points along the way, but we've been guided by Eamon. He has kind of been but that was the whole purpose at the beginning. He was always going to be our kind of guide to take us through, our kind of wizard storyteller, as we described him in one episode. And then, you know, then was our job, along with the production team, to, you know, make sure that other representations of different parts of the potted history were represented, and those views were there. But for most of it, yeah, there was nothing that was off the table.
And to borrow a phrase from Edward Carson, Eamon was the guiding star of the podcast.
I was going to talk about Carson. They're just the kind of things we brought out. I mean, I always say that Carson's first cousin was the person who invented the phrase Sinn Féin. Mary Butler, Mara the Butler, product of the Gaelic League, his first cousin. And she said she was very fond of her cousin Ned. You know, she was from the same upper class background. There was only one thing she couldn't stand about him, and you haven't guessed it: his terrible Dublin accent.
For what it's worth, I probably think we work with two producers, Elaine Dunseith and Gráinne McFadden, and I think they probably watch from a slightly more removed perspective, just to make sure that we're not going too far off. But actually, it's been remarkably easy because the impartiality has been born out of an authentic interest. So if we're talking about Collins and Griffith being in Downing Street talking to Lloyd George and stuff, then instinctively you will turn around and say something like, but I wonder what they're doing in Belfast right now. That's kind of a logical question to ask. So I think that's been an authentic reaction to actually wanting to know where everyone was coming from, and
yeah, so because I think that was sort of last week or the week before. Yeah. Well, hang on a second here. So we've done it. We went to Dublin, and we talked about the receipts were on the table for the plenipotentiaries going over to the talks, the Irish negotiating team, and so we got really kind of involved in that. And the day that we went to Dublin, we came back on the train like two kids who'd just been to a sweet shop. You know, it's like really enthusiastic. This amazing, because the archive in Dublin was just second to none. It was fantastic. But then, then you're kind of going, as Declan says, you're thinking, well, where was James Craig when the talks were going on? What were the back channels there? Was Lloyd George kind of phoning him to tell him what was going on? So then that leads to another one. Well, next week we'll add a bit of that, and obviously that's coming up.
Tara would contact me very often to say, what was
Craig
doing?
Right, that's right, yeah.
And, exactly. I would make a stab at that, and then we would record something, what's happening
at all
here?
Times of day and night, I have to say.
No, it's been great
Sorry,
fun.
Eamon.
Great fun.
Yeah. So the next question is the same question, but to each of you. I'll start with you, Declan. Favourite moment or favourite episode from everything up to now?
Favourite episode is, it's been mentioned already, is the Ian Mcburney. He's the guy in Australia, and his grandfather, the pharmacist. Mm-hmm. That is just a standout moment, partly because Ian just tells it so well, a natural storyteller. So as an episode, I really liked that one. Can I break it down to categories quickly? Production wise, my favourite episode is the shipyard one. It's called The Yard, because at the opening of that there's a big bit of music with clanking hammers and drums and screws, and each one of them has been placed specifically. So that took half a day to get every clang and wallop of a shipyard together. So that's my favourite in that regard. My favourite moment though is my granny. So it's episode 11, and I'll give you the abridged version of this, but when I got my first tape recorder as a kid, I got a little plastic microphone, and my mother said, oh, you should interview your granny, who was living with us at the time before she died. So I was about 9 or 10. And beside the fireplace, she came from a mining background in Roscommon. And so I just started to ask about it. And I don't know why at 9 I was aware of the Black and Tans. I think it's because they'd been mentioned and they always had a sense of being the bogeymen. For whatever reason, that was the perspective that the Roscommon people had on them. So then when you start to ask Granny about her life, you're going to go, tell me about these Black and Tans. And the stories she tells are really quite dramatic. That tape was kept very safe, but ultimately lost in the attic or something. And then when we started this, we were saying, oh, we probably need to do an episode about who was running the country police-wise with the RIC, the Black and Tans. I thought, I'm sure I asked my grandmother about this. I don't know. It just one day popped into my head. And my mum poked through the attic and found the cassette tape, which we got digitised by a neighbour in Letterkenny. And she sent it up. And that was the first time I'd heard Granny's voice for 25 years. So that's there as a kind of a nice moment. And again, whoever knew that my granny would end up on a podcast? The wife of a miner adding to a BBC kind of version of 1921, and that's kind of thrilling. So,
what about you? Yeah. Favourite moment or episode?
Do you know what? Probably now, it changes from week to week, month to month. I mean, Ian Mcburney is a standout. Mary Kiley, who I've already mentioned, is standout for me. But actually, it's this week's episode coming up, which no one will have heard yet, and it's Eamon's story. And that is the standout moment for me. We only recorded it last week, and I'm not gonna spoil it, and I would ask Eamon to do the same, not to share that just at the minute, because it's really something else. And we're putting it together at the minute, and there's sort of elements in it. It coincides with a very, very dark week, the kind of for the whole year. It's the most people are killed in this week coming, 1921. So that's reflected in it as well. But I think it is those personal links and that means something. And I hope you don't mind me saying, Eamon, it felt to us that day that was something so deeply personal to you and that meant a lot to you. So then it was almost like our way of saying, well, actually, thank you for everything that you've done this week, and this is Eamon's link to 1921. So I hope you it's almost like if you only listened to a couple of episodes, it would be Mary Kiley and Ian Mcburney's and Eamon's episode this week coming up.
What about you, Eamon?
Yes, also, I was laying a ghost myself in that episode, which will go on. I suppose, really, it's just this actually happened. Years ago in my early teaching career, kids were sent out to a nursing home in South Belfast to talk to old people about the past, fashions, trams, And there were people of all ages, but some had got into their 90s. And these wee girls come back, with this tape of an old lady who was actually, she lived to be 100, so she must have been mid-90s. And in the middle of it all, she's saying, yes, we got the trams, and then there were the trolley buses. And then she suddenly said, and of course I was in Dublin in 1916 with James Connolly. And, and the kids, of course, were only first years and they hadn't a clue who James Connolly was, or it sounded like a boyfriend. So anyway, they told the story that, she went on to say, well, you see, I was in Common Lamon with James Connolly's daughters, and they lived in the Falls Road and they worked in the mills, and he was in Dublin raising the Irish Citizen Army, and this was the eve of the Rising. Did not explain what the Rising was. And of course we were involved in trying to, if you like, mobilise the volunteers in Ulster at Coal Island, and when that didn't work, we went to Dublin and we saw James Connolly on Easter Monday morning, and he came out of Liberty Hall and he gave us the first copy of the proclamation, and we wanted to take it home, declaring an Irish Republic. He said, no, it might be too dangerous, and gave them dispatches, and she was breathless telling it, and the kids said nothing, so she went on to talk about something else. So I had this tape lying for years and years and years, and of course I got talking to Tara and Declan, and they were talking about that period, about women's involvement in the revolutionary activities, and I said, I have a tape. And they brought it to life in the air. Wasn't that amazing? An old lady in a Belfast nursing home in the about 1980. Incredible.
Was that one of the Core sisters?
One of the Core
Yeah,
sisters. It was Miss Core, actually, and she died. She lived in India Street, and she died in the 90s. One of the few. I mean, most people who were involved in that way, and the like of Common the Mon, would have gone south afterwards. But she continued to live in Belfast, and they were a middle class family. Lived in the Middle Armour Road. Their father was a large property owner. They had gone to concerts in the Ulster Hall, and they had gone to the Philharmonic. But sometime about 1915, she and her sister joined Common the Mon, decided that they wanted an independent Ireland, you know. So, but then you have this authentic voice, and it's the 1916 rising with a Belfast accent, you know.
I love the thought of these kids.
I know.
Some woman, we just asked her about it.
What's she on about? What's she on about? What's she on about?
But you must have thought all your Christmases had come at once. History teacher.
Well, that lay for years. It was only when we had a conversation I thought, I have the answer, and there it was.
Yeah.
Great.
I think I remember reading that witness statement quite a few years ago, and I can't remember which sister it is, but she mentioned seeing Countess Markovich at Liberty Hall, and Countess Markovich was eating a ham sandwich with jam spread on it.
Said she met her that morning, and she never saw this one. Actually, as you say, a jam and a ham in a sandwich, you know. And that was Elizabeth Core, Eilish Nicora, who was a journalist in later years. And the great story was also, we matched this as well, she had worked in the Central Library as a clerk typist up to the Rising, but then she took a few weeks off on unofficial leave, and she lost her job. And the letter recording her sacking is actually held by the library, so it's quite incredible.
Other libraries are available in Belfast, of course. So my final question, I'm wondering, as we approach the end of year 21, are there any plans for, and this isn't directed at anyone in particular, any plans for year 2022? Do you want to give us a scoop this evening?
We're both very clear on the answer to this.
Absolutely no way.
I'll let Tara answer it.
No chance. I know it's awful in a way, because there, you could easily do year to 2022, 1922, and funny, one of our colleagues, Mark Simpson, has been doing a lot of the kind of TV pieces across the year, the kind of key moments for BBC Newsline, and he was then doing the 50 years of 1971. And then he was saying, you could do in 1972. And I said, you fill your boots, off you go, it won't be us. And in some way, I mean, there is a little tiny part of me that would like to do it, but it's only so small, and it's very easily squashed, because although it has been an absolute passion project, and probably I would imagine the thing that we'll be most proud of, when we're sitting in the nursing home, I still don't think that it's just the kind of workload and there was no time off to do it. It was on top of our kind of day job, so it's just been incredibly intense, and for other members of the production team as well. I think if you suggested to them, they would run a mile. So no.
But I think the nature of it has been, I mean, you've said it a couple of times, we were recording you last week. We were with this 100-year-old this week as well. I mean, it's not like we are sitting back working very far in advance, although God knows that's what we wanted to do at the beginning, that we'd be way ahead of ourselves. But the nature of it has been that we are recording. We're going to. I brought my bag with me because we're going to record a couple of links outside afterwards for this week, which we'll edit tomorrow night, Wednesday night, polish on Thursday. It goes up on Friday morning. So, and in between that, we've had people off with COVID. We've had people off with operations, with sickness, with a bit of holiday thrown in. I've sat with a duvet over my head in Dunfanaghy and Donegal in summer holidays, recording links to send back to Belfast. It's just dominated our year.
Yeah.
So, no.
I was just about to say, we'll take that as a yes then. I'd expect episode 1 in January, but I'm sure if we can get enough emails together, we could convince them.
We'll certainly pass the gauntlet on to somebody else.
And actually, the thing that's gotten us through, to be honest, and we've been the amount of times we've recorded links, been talking, episode 45 or 55, whatever, and we've recorded ourselves going, oh, I know, God, we're almost finished. And we have always cut it out because we think people are genuinely with us and they're really enjoying it, and we don't want to be the ones to say, oh we're over this now, because we're not over.
No,
actually.
no, it's just the work.
Yeah, it's been a long, incredibly satisfying year. But I think what's gotten us through mostly is looking forward to 3 weeks' time.
Yes.
When we will have it done and be proud of it and leave it as a job well done, hopefully, and then, let Mark Simpson do his.
Folks, I think that's a natural little partition, pardon the pun, in the show. Has anyone got any questions, contributions, criticisms that they would like to put forward?
I mean, it's interesting that at the beginning it was Eamon is really why it happened, because he kind of lit a fire in your belly and you lit it in mine, and so we started off saying, why don't we just do little weekly 15-minute chats with him in Phoenix's own? And it'll be lovely, and we'll record it once a month for an hour, and we'll chop it into 4 slices, and that'll be it. Easy peasy. And even then they said just do 21 episodes. No, we'll have 50 chats with him. And so it
didn't quite work out that way.
No, I think it worked out great. I mean, you have a whole range of historians, a whole range of views. You have audio, you have James Craig's voice.
Yeah.
We are king's men.
We have you doing Joe Devlin.
Well, this is it. I mean, I was looking for a permanent career. But no, with me doing Joe Devlin. But we brought characters to life, like Joe Devlin, who was an important figure at that time. The whole Carson, I think you found a descendant of Carson's as well. You had that on, and so on. So, I mean, an awful lot of stuff was brought together, it's incredible. And it's there as a resource, not just for students and pupils, but for anybody who's interested in the history of this place, And
has Leonardo DiCaprio been in touch yet about playing Joe Devlin?
Not yet, but
film?
we're hoping,
we're the most stupid thing. It really is. This picture of your man, Owen Devlin, isn't it?
Yeah, but he did look like he was
In this one picture, he looks like Leonardo DiCaprio. He's just stuck all year, and we've seen other pictures, and he looks nothing like Leonardo DiCaprio. But it's how people will remember him now. And the BBC has said it now, so he looks like Leonardo DiCaprio. So it must be true.
I was wondering if I could ask something. Can you pick me up? Tara, at the beginning, I remember you two talking about the difficulty in finding women to contribute to the podcast and getting women's voices. I actually think you did a pretty good job overall, and for me, some of the highlights were Miss Core, like you said, but Kelly Turtle, and also talking to Myrtle Hill and Margaret Ward. I wondered, did that change for you over the year? Did you manage to kind of rope more women in?
I know, it's funny. Again, it's really strange because you maybe expect... because when we're working on the kind of day job, there's a kind of a push for us always to be, the diversity is hugely important, and some days it is very, very difficult. And I mean, I've sort of spent the last 20 years or so coaxing women into talking, particularly on television. I have to say, it's not so difficult to get women to talk on radio, but there's a kind of reluctance and a lack of self-confidence, I think, sometimes, that I think is a legacy of the Troubles, actually, to be honest. So, I remember trying to get the head of, it was a university faculty, and she said, no, I don't want to do it, get my deputy to do it. So I kind of Googled the deputy, and it was a man, and I went back to her and I said, yeah, but you're the head of the faculty, we want to have a much more kind of diverse number of commentators on, so could you please do it? And she still said no. So, but actually with the podcast, I don't think we struggled as much. I think we definitely set out with that in the forefront of our minds, to make it as diverse as possible. But I think we were with a combination of the listener stories, and I mean, Claire, your contribution stands out as well. That sort of standard, because it was one of the few days that we were out in that period of time. We had a couple of, road trips with Eamon, but we were able to go up the Shankill Road. And do you remember the neighbour who came out and she had worked in the mills? And it just those kind of like little moments. And it was very important to reflect both women, but also the children episode always sticks with me as well, because children, even, they were caught in the crossfire, but they were largely forgotten. And I always remember, I think it was Kelly told the story, or it might have been Liz Grillis, about the story of the priest who was shot and injured, but a 12-year-old boy was killed, and the headline was "Priest has lucky escape." So it's even in even in how the coverage was developed at that time, the children were kind of lesser importance than the adults. So there was I think that was something that was quite interesting, that we kind of pulled out that doesn't really get a lot of attention. And there were people like Liz Grillis and Kelly and yourself looking at, I always remember the vaccination, the relative who was taken to court for not vaccinating the children, and the large number of maternal deaths, and the large, maybe 15 children, but only 6 survive. So there were moments that were telling a story about the kind of social demographics of the day, the deprivation, the poverty. I always remember Kelly's the poem as well, which was the dad's, who was off work from the shipyard and then wrote this poem from the woman's perspective. And, and we joked, of course, he had time to write a poem while he was looking after the children. So I don't think it was as difficult as perhaps, but I think that's been right across the board. I think a lot of the things that we really kind of talked about and were worried about and were conscious of actually were much easier and much more straightforward than we had thought. So I hope we did do a good reflection of the different kind of sections of society across the year.
I would just add, it's mainly Tara who has booked the expert contributors and done all that work. But it would be fair to say, wouldn't it, that at the beginning of the year, this was not pushing against open doors. We had lots of people who refused, didn't want to take part in it.
Massively,
just
yeah.
thought it was, no, I don't want to get involved in that kind of a weekly telling of year 21, too hot to handle.
And I do think, and it was slightly depressing at the beginning, because there were definitely a few people who you would have thought would have been delighted, but I think it was social media put them off. And I think they feared, despite our rules of engagement, I think they were worried that they would have, just got a bit of flack that they could just do without, quite frankly. So they perhaps stepped back from it, and I don't know if they're disappointed about that or not. We certainly were at the beginning, but
you can assume they are.
Yes, well, absolutely. I mean, now considering its status, but no, But I suppose it was a sign of the time. We were asking sort of the end of December, beginning of January, before the year had begun. So there was still a lot, as we said earlier, there was still a lot of anxiety about how are we going to mark the year, that kind of trying to, we'd sort of had partition, and the creation of Northern Ireland was always the way, that so in a way was that satisfactory for kind of both communities. But, some people don't see it like that either, so there's a counter narrative to that as well. While you might think, oh, well, that's kind of, there we are, we're looking at both sides, but some people don't view it that way either. They just feel that it's too contentious and too difficult, and they don't want to look back on it.
Eamon, can I just take you back to the gender issue there for a second? I mean, I know from taking walks around the city and city cemetery and stuff, the history of women in the city tends to be anonymous, it's fair to say. But do you think over the course of the decade we've got better at engaging with women's stories?
Well, certainly in this series, I mean, the Women's Unionist Association has featured, Lady Londonderry, who was a powerful hostess, close to Carson, even an advisor to Carson has featured. Working class women like Winifred Carney, have crossed the stage. James Connolly's secretary, who stood in East Belfast in 1918 as a Sinn Féin candidate, but insisted that she was standing for a workers' republic. We brought in people like that, So, I mean, I think that we've tried. There are fewer accounts by women, it's absolutely true. But then a lot of the people who have contacted the programme have been women, and they've brought their own stories there. Yeah. Voiceless people who actually found a voice through the series. So I think that's good.
And there was one listener who was living in Derby and had spoken to you, started to research her family history, and then gone to Fermanagh, where her grandfather was from. And she had no link to Northern Ireland, in terms of her. She'd never lived here. But she went back, and she was a Shakespeare specialist. That was her job in a university in England. And she said she went round and she found the school and the old school records where her grandfather had taught. And then there were, I think it was some years ago she'd gone to speak to some really elderly people who were pupils of her grandfather. And the thing they all talked about was Shakespeare. And she had no idea but once she dug into the records, she was convinced then that was like a little moment of kind of, a connection and something that was, almost in DNA that she had never known about, but was able to uncover this history, and she was fascinated by it. And again, there was a generational gap, I think, with a lot of people. I know Kieran Glennon would say this as well. His father had never spoken about what his father had been involved in, but then Kieran's generation had looked at it and said, oh right, and then on his father's 80th birthday they presented him with a kind of, this is your life, this is the family history, which he had known none of it, because his father had never spoken about it again. Once the war was over, then that was it. He had never mentioned it. So
and that's
that
something
was
that has come out, for example, Frank Aiken, who was a major IRA figure from South Armagh and became a political figure in the South, and a controversial figure who may have been involved in the Alt-Neve shootings of Protestants outside Uri. But his son told me that his father had never ever spoken to the family about his involvement. He did say that when Liam Lynch was killed during the Civil War, he actually then, of course, brought about the ceasefire, ended the Civil War, and he told his son that Liam Lynch would never have accepted a surrender, ever. He was a fanatic. But in general, when it came to the North, in which he was heavily involved and where he was from, nothing was ever said. A few people came every week throughout the years who were sort of northern figures he'd known, and they were closeted in a room for hours together with a few drinks, talking clearly about those days, but it was never ever recorded, So you get stories like that are quite amazing. But as I say, these new stories, these pieces of information about the flotsam and jetsam of people who suffered, and their stories were never recorded, has actually been, one of the great discoveries of this series.
Well, you mentioned Frank Aiken there.
Yes.
There's an episode about the Attaboil train bombing.
Yes.
And we had that planned, it was all going ahead, and the week before, out of nowhere, we get an email from a man saying, I don't know whether you're planning to do the Attaboil train bombing at some point, but I was a young lad. And he tells the story about going home and hearing two men on the other side of a hedge arguing, drunk. They'd come off the bus or the train from Dublin because they'd been down to see Frank Aiken. They had worked with Frank Aiken as part of an IRA ambush many, many years before the Attaboil train bombing. And Frank Aiken had left them sitting outside his office all day and had refused to meet them, essentially. And they were coming back up, swearing blind that Frank Aiken had either deserted them or blaming each other or whatever it was. But this man, as a kid, remembers seeing them through the hedges having this argument. He got in touch with us the week before the episode went out. So then we put him starring role in the quick re-edit. We have an eyewitness. And that's not a story that probably even deserves to be in a history book, because in a sense it's unsubstantiated. How do we know, but actually he was a guy who checked out and he had a story to tell and wanted to tell it, and that's a lovely little moment that...
And we tell the story of the lamplighter in EastSide
Yes,
Partnership. Robert McKelvey,
lovely.
One of the few working class autobiographies of that period, a man who plied both sides of this road in East Belfast in the dark days of 1921, 1922, and described, the snipers sweeping the streets and how the people would say to him, Mr. McKelvey, you're lighting up our streets, but as soon as you leave, we're breaking the mantles because you're illuminating the area for gunmen. And he said that, on one occasion a bullet sort of parted his hair. He was very lucky. And he says they swept the streets and they checked the papers the next day to see they'd got people of the right religion. It was that brutal, But his account sort of found, took flight in the series as well,
Yeah. And that was funny because do you remember in at the end of December when we first had those kind of conversations with you? And we went and had a cup of coffee, and that was one of the first stories that you had told us. And it was that was the thing, because you enthused us at every opportunity, or at every point that we had those initial discussions. And I think, the Declan story about Peter McAvoy getting in touch about Attaboil there, it would be nice to sit here and say, yes, and we planned this and we planned that, and it worked. So, it was a lot of luck, a lot of hard work, a lot of great knowledge, that, just happened to come together at the right time. And if we didn't get it for the week that it was, then very often somebody would listen to an episode and go, well, I've got a link to that one, and then we could run it the next week.
Can I just say as well, your memory is astonishing that you remember that man's name. And this has kept us right. You wonder how we kept right the whole year through. This is how we've kept right. Tara Mills's memory is good. Didn't we speak to someone last February who mentioned something about, like, in next week, not this week, the week after next, we're going to talk about cycling and how the identity of team cycling on the island and stuff. I don't remember having that conversation back in February. I was like, we must get that cycling bit in next week. Absolutely no idea. So how you remember his name?
Yeah. I don't know. It's just, I suppose those weird conversations by Zoom over the summer months, you know, those people kind of all stuck in my head, but ask me to do any of those sound effects and I wouldn't have a clue. So we're quite lucky we've got the two sides of the coin.
But the fantastic thing is I'm stopped by people who are not historians, never did history at school, maybe aren't privileged in the sense that they didn't have the opportunity to have a good education at all, and they're all talking about this, you know. And it's a great story about it, you know. Everybody is finding their niche in this series, you know, and you know it is broadening their knowledge and broadening their views as well, because it's such a human story amidst all the tragedy and politics and high politics, you know.
I was just about to ask a similar question of you, Declan. Do you get a sense of the types of people who are listening to the podcast? Because I know whenever I'm speaking to people about my podcast, a lot of people go, podcast? What's that? Or how do we access this?
Yeah, well, look,
that's the biggest thing.
There is a real problem with podcasting, and we are partly responsible at the BBC and any other kind of broadcast platform. We kind of say, listen to the podcast. And my sister is 41, 42, and she went, I've never actually listened to a podcast. And where do I listen to podcasts? And it's remarkably easy platform to engage with, actually, because it comes preloaded on your phone. So there is a problem with podcasting. I think we assume too much knowledge. Yeah. But as for who is listening to it, I mean, I've been constantly surprised. I mean, we have heard stories of, David Bruce, the Presbyterian moderator who's in it, is listening to it. We know MLAs are listening to it. We were mentioned in the chamber of the assembly. Judges
yes,
are listening to it.
Yeah.
And then kind of the real audience, though, was not them. It's nice to have them along for the ride, but the real audience was people like us who kind of casually interested and like a good yarn told well. And if at the end of the year they can feel a little bit more in command of the story of this place, so isn't that lovely? But you know, we haven't at any stage ever shied away from the fact that we want it to just be a good tale. So if you like a good story, then you might enjoy this one. But as for who is listening, it's very difficult to tell. But I mean, we're approaching 500,000 downloads, which is not 500,000 listeners. It's 500,000 downloads. I should say that, but I'd like it to be 500,000 listeners. But 500,000 downloads for on average 50 episodes. That's remarkably more than we could have hoped for, given that we're doing it in our spare time. You know, but who they all are. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you're some of them, I presume. So
is anyone not listening to the podcast? Is anybody here ignorant of the whole thing and is going to go back and listen to it all?
What a long evening you've had.
I know, it's funny because I've had so many different people. I have a kind of so many times that, you know, I remember being in the shop and a very young Australian girl saying to me, I recognised your, because I'd asked her something, she said, I recognised your voice straight away. You do that podcast, don't you? And I laughed, and we had this big conversation, and the lockdown had helped her. You know, she couldn't get home, and she absolutely loved it. And coming from Australia, she just wanted to know a bit of Irish history. I've had people come up to me in the bank, in the supermarket. And then recently I was at the centenary service in Armagh, and a couple of people down there, you know, the bishop had said that he was listening to it. One of the police officers said he was absolutely addicted to it, was just waiting week by week. But the thing that has entertained me then in my head, I have the people who, you know, Sam McBride from the newsletter on that day said to me, I keep it for a Friday, and when I'm doing the dishes I listen to it. And then somebody else was blowing leaves in their garden yesterday, and then they tweeted that, and then somebody else replied, said, I was doing that, I was doing the leaves as well, but I was listening to the Year 21 podcast, and it made it so much more enjoyable. So I quite like those ones. I have a lot of people who run and listen to it, or go out for big walks and listen to it. Some people like to listen to it weekly, other people, you know, wait and maybe have 4 episodes and listen to and binge listen.
I wonder, had we known who would listen to it, or had we thought too much about who would listen to it,
I think
whether it would have influenced us early on. I don't think we gave it much thought. We just worked on the assumption that if we don't know that much but we're interested and we'd like to learn it in a safe space, then there are probably others, but it's a much larger cross-section of people than we would have thought.
Yeah, and I do think the education fundamentally, the way history is taught here, I think, is part of the reason that it's been successful. And that's not to disrespect history teachers by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it can be so limited. I mean, even that story you tell about the 60s, where it's, there's a fear of it. Oh, this country, do we have to, who's going to be in the class? Will we offend people in a class? All those kind of conversations. And I think that's what makes it so interesting for people, because they really are coming at it from where we have come at it, which is a point of very little knowledge.
I think there is a teacher here, Charlotte, is it?
Yeah.
Oh.
What's your sense of how this podcast is affecting the pupils in your class?
Oh, I mean, I'm not the right person to ask that, because I've only been in Northern Ireland teaching for a year, so I'm only getting used to the curriculum, and I'm very upset that most children don't do history GCSE here, and that's something that I would really like to change and be part of changing. I think all children should learn our history till they're 16, but what happens is that in our horrible selective system, only children who are considered to be academically kind of capable get to do GCSE history, and it's a real shame, because it means lots of children just don't get to learn about us, about who we are, about how we've got here.
And we've been really lucky, because a lot of, I'm thinking of Peter Mulholland at Lagan, was one of our first history teachers who was, hugely supportive, and was sort of getting his students, his A-level history students, to listen to the podcast right from the beginning. And then in fact getting, there were a couple of episodes where he'd say to them, right, go and listen to that and write a critique of that person's view on something. So that was really impressive as far as I was concerned. That was, another step on. So we've been very lucky, and I know a lot of schools have promoted it, and because it's, obviously for the A-level curriculum, the treaty and the 1921 talks all feature heavily in the curriculum, so it's been useful, and it has been a useful resource. But that has sort of been something that we're very grateful for, that support from the history kind of faculties and school departments right across the board.
Okay, so I think we've reached the end of the conversation, and it's been a good one. I think you'll agree. So thanks to Declan, thanks to Tara, and thanks to Dr. Eamon Phoenix.
Thank you.
Thanks.